Morning, everyone. Just give it a few more seconds, just to let a few more people join up, and then we'll get started for today's webinar. We're a couple of minutes past, so I don't know more people will join, but just thank you everyone for joining us today, and welcome to today's webinar for the Sizewell C Supply Chain Beginner's Guide to NEC Contracts. My name is Shorey-Mills. I'll be chairing today, and we'll introduce you throughout the session to our other panel of speakers. We are recording today's session, so post the event, we will post the recording of the webinar and all of the questions and answers that we pose at the end onto our website, so that you've got it as a reference point. You will see at the bottom of the screen there are a few options. There we go. Please, feel free to use the chat function. Introduce yourself if you're on there. Send any messages, any comments. If you do have any questions, we will be doing a Q&A at the end. Please try where possible to put the questions in the Q&A box. That'll help us massively. And like I say, all aspects, both for the project, for the supply chain support, and from the Birketts team, will handle all the questions at the end. The purpose of these webinars for us really is about helping businesses to get ready for Sizewell C, but also more widely the breadth of projects that are going to come to this region, and certainly gearing up a supply chain to be fitter and more ready for the opportunities that are going to be ahead. So today, obviously joined by Birketts, and we thank them for their support so far on the Sizewell C project, both directly supporting EDF and Sizewell C to date, but also the work that we're doing at the Suffolk Chamber of Commerce and helping businesses like yourselves to kind of get a little bit more fit for this opportunity. Throughout the presentation today, there will be 5 or 6 polls that we will be posting a few questions. These will be interactive. We'll need and want your answers if possible, please. And again, this kind of helps, particularly the team at Birketts, understand the level of understanding around NEC contracts and where that tailored support moving forward needs to be. I will start, though, just with a very quick update on the actual Sizewell C project before I hand over to Steve Carrol, who will talk a little bit about why NEC3 for the Sizewell C project, and then hand over to the team from Birketts, who will give the bulk of today's presentation. So just as a reminder for any of you who haven't seen this picture or haven't seen this picture for a little while, this is what we're aiming to do. In 10 to 12 years' time, this is what the view of the Suffolk coast will look like. A on the bottom left, B in the middle, still operational, and then C to the top of the screen with 2 new reactors producing power, and importantly, producing our own energy security power, so we don't have the experiences that we're currently having. Quite nice to see actually Finland, which went online a few weeks ago with their EPR. They've also helped by the fact that they are now heavily reliant on nuclear power in Finland, have seen about a 75% drop in their energy bills. Various factors within that, but nuclear being a key reason. So it does show that actually once you get nuclear well and truly into the mix, and Finland are now very heavily reliant on nuclear, it can make a massive, massive difference. But I said earlier about the broader spectrum. Now, we're here for Sizewell C and the support that Birketts are happy to give businesses. That is our role. But actually, just understanding NEC contracts has a much wider impact. And so as a business today, if you're not used to NEC contracts, and hopefully you'll get greater understanding from today, it won't just benefit Sizewell C. Actually, large-scale projects will use this type of contracting standard quite regularly. And this stat, which is a couple of years old now, so probably underestimates the scale of the opportunity in this region. But over the next 25 years, there's £122 billion worth of investment in major projects. And these numbers don't include things like hydrogen and some of the other new technology which is coming on all the time. And those large-scale projects, those large-scale contractors are going to want to contract using forms like NEC3. So actually understanding and joining these webinars, whilst we hope it helps you get to work on Sizewell C, it will actually just help you with other opportunities that are coming to this region, be that offshore wind, some of the huge transport infrastructure that's needed, and of course, all the other projects which are potentially there. Our coastline is perfectly situated for this green energy home security revolution, and this is a great starting point. So as a brief update on where the project is, last year was very much a year of milestones. We had the development consent order passed in July last year. Can't believe that's nearly a year ago. The then Prime Minister visited in September to kind of publicly back Sizewell C and to say we need to get on with it. And we, as a result of that and the development consent order, have seen since early September last year preparatory works on site taking place, particularly around ecology and archaeology, but all about getting ready so that when the project officially can start, that it's in a position to start immediately. The government in November announced their investment decision and put about £700 million into the project and took a 50% stake with EDF in the early works. And so as a result of that, that gave the project the confidence to get really cracking with some of those preparatory works. There's aspects around some of the permits and obviously the recent judicial review where there's still a little bit of clarity to be made, but ultimately the plan is still to see a final investment decision in this Parliament. We certainly, from a supply chain perspective, are focusing that around March of next year to at least help businesses begin to prepare. And things like today's webinar and other support should now ramp up over the course of the next few months as a result of that work. So this year, it's very much about setting up the delivery organisation for Sizewell C, bringing the people into the project that need to be there to be able to help this get started and get on the road to getting built. Things like the strategies, the minimum standards, the schedule are all being worked on as we speak, and we're confident within the next few weeks we should start to be able to help businesses understand when they're going to be expected, in particular on those first 2 years of the project, all the off-site work and all the preparatory work that needs to take place. Obviously, there's ongoing work to secure all funding that's required for the project, hence the aim for financial close at some point in the early part of 2024. And the work with the existing tier ones is underway to try and help them understand what scale of ability local businesses have. We will be holding some Meet the Buyer events and looking at getting businesses involved in ECI very, very soon. It's just always about time. The key for us, if we're going to take a day of your busy time to put you in front of buyers from either the alliances or from Sizewell C themselves, it needs to be the right time for them, but it also needs to ensure we maximise the time you give us. We don't want to waste your time doing things too early. So although sometimes it can be frustrating, and I know a lot of you want to meet the buyers as quickly as possible, it's about picking the right time, and trust us, as much as we can, we'll try and do that for you. We're increasing our relationship with Hinkley to ensure that shared learning and that shared understanding of their experience down there. And recently, many of you would have seen the economic report from Hinkley, which now has a local supply chain value of over £5 billion, which should breed huge amounts of confidence to local businesses over here that actually it's not just talk, it is actually stuff that will happen to benefit the local supply chain. But very much this next year is all about our chance to get ready. Key to that is the portals. Obviously, a lot of you today will be registered on our portal, hence you've got the invites, etc. So fantastic, and thank you. But also, just as a reminder, please ensure, in addition to our portal, you must make sure you signed up for CompeteFor as well. CompeteFor will be the place where all opportunities will be competitively tendered. There has been another one recently loaded to do with software. And again, as the project gets into the right place, they will appear more and more regularly. The advantage of being signed up for CompeteFor, aside from Sizewell C, is there's other projects use that platform as well. So again, that message of let's all get ready for Sizewell C, but also let's look at all these opportunities that are coming for this region, but also for the UK. And big point really for Sizewell, and it's being amplified at the moment, particularly with hydrogen, is the exciting opportunity that Sizewell will bring to this region outside of just producing nuclear power. And the reason I left this slide on here is we're keen at the moment to talk to any businesses that are either engaged with hydrogen or would like to be engaged with hydrogen, please do get in contact with me and the team, as we're working with Sizewell to kind of map out what the opportunity is of hydrogen in this region. But Sizewell as a whole has the ability to not just produce that low carbon energy, but do some of the things you see on the graphic and written on the right hand side to really try and help this region, particularly things like district heating, obviously hydrogen, clean fuels for our shipping industry, which is a massive part of Suffolk in particular, and even things like desalination, which we know there is water issues in this region. And so therefore, if we can find effective ways to desalinate water by using waste heat from things like Sizewell, then suddenly you've got a fantastic solution for the agriculture industry to save our water issue. Our key themes stay the same, and particularly those first three. The focus is still truly on local, to ensure that businesses are involved that are across those 6 counties of the east that we still actively represent. And we want to continue to foster collaboration rather than competition for this project. We're seeing some brilliant examples already of local businesses now working together to get ready for Sizewell, and we want to see more of that. And we will support and assist that as much as we can. And our previous webinar, of which the recording is still on the website, was all about joint ventures, the legal aspect of this, and also how to approach it. So please, the team from Birketts, more than happy to support any business have questions on that, but also please take a look at the webinar if you're unable to attend that one, and see if that helps get some greater understanding of joint ventures. There has to be a legacy. Particularly there has to be a legacy for the immediate area around Sizewell, areas like Leiston, but actually for the whole region. Again, these projects that are coming, they give us huge opportunity. So therefore, how do we build a workforce that's suitable for Sizewell, but also then suitable for post-Sizewell and the other projects that are going to be there? But particularly that's around how we create a legacy of a diverse and inclusive workplace, particularly focusing on people and communities and really raising the bar of this part of the country. And of course, as mentioned, how to contribute, and our region will heavily contribute, particularly around areas of nuclear and offshore wind and hydrogen, to the UK's 2050 net zero ambitions. And this is a huge opportunity for us. And that commitment of over £4 billion to the east of England is a massive one. It's one we want to make the most of. It's one we want to exceed as much as possible. And we are doing every piece of work we can to ensure that local businesses really take a decent chunk of that 4.4 billion. And the way in which all of those commitments and all of that local and legacy environment will be delivered is through social value and ESG. It will be critical on this project. We will very soon be emailing out the dates for webinars on these subject areas, working with experts in the region and also the social value and ESG leads from Sizewell C, who are very keen to ensure that all businesses understand actually what social value means to Sizewell C, and how ESG will play a critical part in ensuring that local businesses will work on Sizewell C. It's not just talk, it will actually be evidenced, and we will support businesses in understanding the best ways to do that. So continue to work with us. That's the critical thing. Thank you if you've turned up today. That means, we've got your right emails and you're obviously engaged with us. But just come to the team, whether it's myself or the people like Julia and Sam that are out and about everywhere, Ian, who's often speaking to you about your portal entry. We're there to help you. So please come forward. If there's any questions you have, any advice you want, any relationships you want to try and foster, then just give us a shout. That's ultimately what we're there to support you with. And as much as possible, we will help you along that journey. So at this point, I will stop talking. I will ask if Steve can switch on his camera, and I'll hand you over to Steve. And yeah, I'll see you again at the end for the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ashley. Great introduction, and thanks for giving the project update. Thanks all for joining us. NEC is a suite of contracts that really facilitates something of this scale. And when we talk about scale, we're talking huge. Sizewell C will be one of the biggest construction sites in Europe in the coming years. And successful delivery to us is building Sizewell as quickly as we possibly can. In doing that, it allows us to take 9 million tonnes of carbon out of the atmosphere every year by producing clean electricity. So the quicker we do it, the better. And key to delivering it quickly is communications. We'll have a critical path or multiple critical paths to get us to the point of producing electricity. And that critical path can only be maintained if we talk to each other through the project and through the supply chain. The NEC suite of contracts, of which I've been operating for many years now at Sizewell B, lends itself to those communication channels and regular, consistent, accurate communications between the contractor and between the employer. Now, I said it's a great set of terms and conditions. It is. It's industry proven set of terms and conditions for projects like this. And key to it is your engagement in it. It's not a contract that you sign, you agree, and you put on the shelf. It's something that you'll have to use on a daily basis. It's something that you'll have to use to communicate to the employer when you're talking about delays or compensation events, which the team will come on to later. But my experience is that it's there to help you as a contractor understand exactly what it is you need to deliver, when you need to deliver it, what you should expect from the employer, what the employer is to provide to you when the employer is to provide it. And then it's there to hold people to account, and it's there to hold the employer to account as well. And as long as you document what you're doing along that journey, then it should work very well for this type of project and for yourselves. It's really non-adversarial. It really is about good, open, honest communications about where we are in the project, what support you might need, who you need to talk to, and it sets out those roles and responsibilities really well. So I hope you get a lot out of this session. The team at Birketts have as Ashley said, kindly given up their time to support us with this. And I would say, you know, if you've got any concerns about it, or you find yourself at the point where you're awarded a contract and or you're tendering and negotiating the contract and you need some support, then the team at Birketts are there to help you through it. So on that, I'm not going to talk more because you really want to hear from the experts. I'm going to hand you over to Stefan Harris-Wright, who's going to talk you through really what NEC is. So thank you for that, and have a good webinar.
Great stuff. Thanks very much, Steve and Ashley. Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to join you this morning for what I hope you're going to find to be a useful and hopefully informative session. Yeah, my name's Stefan Harris-Wright. I'm a partner at Birketts Solicitors, and I head up the construction and engineering team within the firm. First off, I just wanted to say we're really delighted to have been asked by Suffolk Chamber of Commerce to partner with them and be their kind of recommended law firm, if you like, for helping to support members of theirs in the Sizewell C Supply Chain. I mean, it probably goes without saying, but Sizewell is obviously a very exciting and opportunity and project for businesses in the region, and we're very much looking forward to supporting those efforts. So hopefully you've heard of Birketts, but just in case you haven't, we are a full service law firm with over 1,000 staff and about 100 partners or so, and we work across our 6 offices in East Anglia, our roots very firmly in that region, but also in London and in Kent. If I could have the next slide, please. So I'm joined this morning by 2 of my colleagues from our construction team. Firstly, Sophie Thornley, a senior associate, and also Patrick Cooney, one of our legal directors, and you will hear from them a little bit later on. If I could have the next slide, please. So myself, Sophie and Patrick are all part of a wider kind of specialist team, really. And as you can see, hopefully from this slide, it's a pretty extensive team, and we've got real kind of strength in depth when it comes to advising on construction and engineering matters. Good. Move on to the next slide, please. So the slides will be circulated later, as I think was mentioned by Ashley, and you've got our contact details on that team slide, but we've also got a dedicated Sizewell C email address, which is regularly monitored, which is up here on the screen. So please don't hesitate to get in touch if you require legal assistance on your involvement with Sizewell C, or indeed, as Ashley mentioned, any of those other large range of capital projects that are coming forward in the region over in the coming years. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, so today's session is, as we've heard, all about an introduction to the NEC 3 form of engineering contracts. Some of you might have attended the first of these webinars, which Ashley mentioned, which was back in January. We covered a range of different things there, including some joint ventures and partnering and public procurement and so on. But for my part, I talked about procurement structures and forms of contract, and I gave a sort of high level kind of mention of some of the key points about NEC contracts. But this session goes into some more of the key themes of NEC in some more detail. The focus in these sessions, as you will have gathered, is really on the supply chain. So we focused in this presentation on the NEC form of subcontract, but actually all of the themes that we cover are equally applicable to the main contract as well. So whatever level of the supply chain you're getting involved in, whether that's as a main contractor or subcontractor, it's likely that, you know, the themes that we're going to be talking about are going to be relevant to a lot of the procurement and the contracting that you're going to be doing as and when you get involved in these works packages and these projects. So up on the slide here is a bit of a summary of what we're going to cover. I won't read out all of those points, but hopefully you get the general idea. And you'll see that we've broken down the session into 3 main sections to be covered off by myself, Sophie and Patrick. Ashley mentioned there's a bit of audience participation, just to make sure you're all paying attention, as I'm sure you will be. We've got some quick kind of multiple choice polls for you to take part in, but don't worry, the questions are all pretty gentle and it is all anonymous. So please do have a go at the polls as we go through. I appreciate some of your knowledge of NEC will be, you know, different to others in this sort of audience group, but it's just intended to be a bit of fun, really. And then, as Ashley mentioned, there's a chance at the end for some further Q&A. So send those questions in as we go through, and we'll pick those up. If I could have the next slide, please. So, without further ado, I will move on and get into part 1 of our beginner's guide. And if I could have the next slide, please. So just to recap on some of the things I covered in January, for anybody also that wasn't able to attend that session. So what is NEC? Well, NEC stands for the New Engineering Contract. So it's a full suite of engineering and construction contracts, consultant appointments and subcontracts, the kind of whole shooting match, if you like. It's published by a professional body called the Institution of Civil Engineers, and there have been several editions since it started life way back in 1993. The current version is NEC 4, which came out in 2017. And one thing to mention is that it's extremely widely used, as you probably will have gathered from some of the comments from Ashley and Steve. It's in fact the second most popular industry standard form of contract in the UK after the JCT form. And actually NEC has been really popular with central government. So it was endorsed by the Office of Government Commerce back in 2008 when the OGC was still around, and it's still very widely used on things like public sector frameworks in particular. What else about NEC? Well, it's intended to be extremely versatile, and it can be used for any kind of construction or engineering project, or indeed for a term service agreement like maintenance works. And just to give some kind of further context, I've mentioned on the slide here several high profile examples of projects and client bodies where NEC has been used, and those include things like the Olympics, Network Rail, Crossrail, Highways England as well, and also the first phase of much of the works packages on the HS2 project. Indeed, also very widely used on the Hinkley Point new nuclear project, where EDF are also involved. So clearly it's a form of contract that's really well suited to high value complex projects, and hopefully you can see why there's an expectation that it's going to be used on Sizewell C. And what about Sizewell C? Well, our understanding, albeit I suppose kind of unconfirmed and unofficial, is that NEC 3 is likely to form the basis of the contracts that are being used for all of the projects. So probably needless to say, it's going to be really critical for your prospects of bidding on Sizewell C supply chain opportunities that you've got a decent understanding of the NEC form, and hopefully that's where we can come in and help you. If we could have the next slide, please. So what are some of the key characteristics of NEC? Well, part of the reason why it's been so popular is that it embraces a really collaborative and kind of non-adversarial approach to contracting. And it's actually something of a kind of radical departure from other industry standard forms of contract, which were traditionally much more kind of confrontational, if you like, and didn't have a sort of ethos of trying to avoid disputes. But I suppose if I was to kind of summarize the three key characteristics of the objectives of NEC, then those are up on the slide here. So just to run through those, NEC takes a really kind of proactive approach to risk management. So it's meant to be a project management tool. And the theme kind of here really on a recurring basis is that it's really a live document. And as Steve said, it's not something that should be signed and put on the shelf or in the desk drawer. It should be referred to regularly and constantly updated and relied upon. Secondly, here it sort of relies really a great deal and significantly on open communication between the parties, and also encourages the parties to kind of show a willingness to work together to solve problems. And this recurring theme of trying to avoid disputes is very much a sort of partnering ethos and working together to avoid costly and time-consuming litigation and legal proceedings. So I suppose those kind of objectives are really only achievable if the parties sort of fully embrace the NEC philosophy. It's very much meant to be collaborative and open. Couple of things to mention on sort of key roles that you'll see mentioned in NEC forms of contract. First of those is the project manager. So at a main contract level, that's the party appointed by the client to administer the contract. And also you'll see reference to a supervisor. This is the party appointed by the client to carry out what you might refer to sort of more traditionally as the sort of clerk of work. So this is somebody that's checking that quality is in accordance with the contract and the works are being dealt with appropriately. Finally, on this slide, probably worthwhile mentioning that just kind of by virtue of its nature, being a sort of proactive, live document that everyone's meant to refer to regularly, it very much incentivizes that for a number of reasons that we'll come on to. And consequently, it can be sort of viewed as being a bit sort of administratively burdensome or kind of heavy on that side. So it definitely requires kind of more effort, if you like, from the parties to kind of comply with the obligations and operate it in the way that it's meant to be operated. Okay, if I could have the next slide, please. So I wanted to start now kind of taking you through some of the key concepts in the contract and starting off with the opening section, which is entitled kind of general obligations. So I mentioned that NEC is intended to encourage a kind of collaborative and sort of non-adversarial style of contracting. And this ethos is actually kind of enshrined in one of the very first clauses in the contract, which is sort of summarized in that quotation there, which states that the parties will act in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. And this is a really kind of recurring theme which runs through the whole of the contract, and it sort of underpins the whole thing really. Next bullet there was around about entire agreement clauses. So something to be aware of. What this does is basically prevent the parties from relying on anything which is not expressly part of the contract. So this, from your point of view, really important to ensure that any agreed kind of contract documents, quotations, specifications, proposals, drawings, whatever it might be, if you're seeking to rely on that, then you need to make sure it's part of the contract, because there's a provision that says if you don't do that, then you can't rely on it. So things like correspondence, meeting minutes, or other items, if they're really critical to describe your scope or the limitations of your quotation, your proposal, your price, your program, really key that those are referred to in the contract. What about communications, things like notices and the like? Well, there's a detailed kind of section setting out how communication has to be dealt with between the parties. Essentially, communications have to be in writing, and there's something called a period for reply. So this is a specified duration within which parties are supposed to respond to communications. And again, this is kind of consistent with the overarching themes of NEC being proactive and responsive. And so failing to respond within the period for reply can have kind of negative consequences for the parties, particularly if there's a disagreement later on about whether or not early engagement with a particular issue could have prevented an outcome or mitigated cost or program impact and so on. I wanted to mention about ambiguities and inconsistencies. So there's a provision of the contract which sets out how kind of conflicts between contract documents are dealt with, and essentially the contract provides that either party has to notify the other as soon as they become aware of an issue with the contract documents, and then the contractor, in a main contractor subcontractor scenario, will issue an instruction to the subcontractor to resolve the issue. And I'll come on later to talk about who carries the risk of discrepancies in contract documents. Sort of penultimate point on here was around illegal and impossible requirements. I mean, that might sound a bit dramatic, but essentially the subcontractor or contractor has to notify the other party if they feel the contract requires them to do anything that's illegal or impossible. And if that happens, then an instruction would be issued to essentially change the contract documents to overcome that issue. And then finally on this slide is the idea or the concept of prevention. I wanted to mention this. I mean, you might have heard before of provisions in contracts which deal with something called force majeure. So this is essentially a situation whereby an event occurs which prevents one of the parties from complying with their obligations. So NEC deals with this through the concept of prevention. And essentially, if there's an event which occurs which stops the subcontractor from completing their works, and it's something which neither party could prevent, and it's also something which an experienced subcontractor couldn't have foreseen, then this clause will be triggered, and the contractor gives an instruction to the subcontractor confirming how they should deal with that particular prevention issue. And prevention can result in something called a compensation event, and Sophie's going to talk about compensation events in some more detail later on. Okay, folks, so it's time to have the first bit of audience participation. So Ashley has kindly put that up on the slide for you here, so hopefully you can see that. So the question is around ambiguities and inconsistencies in the subcontract document. So it's true or false, the cost and time consequences of ambiguities and inconsistencies in the subcontract documents are the contractor's risk. Is it true? Is it false? Or is it the lawyer's answer? It depends. Please vote now. I feel a bit like Graham Norton on Eurovision at the weekend, but hopefully you'll do better than the UK entry. So we'll just give it a moment or two for people to send in their answers. And I'm sure the Suffolk Chamber team will make a call at some stage once we've got some results collated. Sure, that's
you go, Stefan.
Right now. Aha, here we go. So hopefully you can see that. So cost and time of resolving ambiguities and inconsistencies are the contractor's risk. So quite a split here. So 17% said true, 31% said false, 52% of you thought it was the lawyer's answer, which was it depends. So the answer is it depends. So well done to those 52%. Basically, the unamended NEC contract provides that the risk lies with the party who produced the part of the subcontract which contains the ambiguity or the inconsistency. So if the problem arises from a drawing or a specification prepared by the subcontractor, it's the subcontractor who bears time and cost risk of dealing with the problem and vice versa. So yeah, useful point to note. Something else to mention on this is around kind of amendments to NEC, and Sophie is going to talk about Z clauses and amendments. So the position I've just described is what's in a standard NEC contract, but quite often that will get changed to push the risk of ambiguities or inconsistencies completely onto one party or another. So yeah, if it's an amended contract, that's definitely something to check. Could we have the next slide, please? Thank you. Right, so still on the subject of the general section of the contract, I wanted to explain a really key concept of NEC, which is all about kind of early warning notices and the early warning regime. Early warning obligations are really central to the NEC ethos of being proactive and avoiding disputes, as we've already said. So essentially how this works is that both parties have an obligation to give an early warning notice as soon as they become aware of any matter which could either increase the price, delay completion, delay a key date, so in other words, a milestone, or impair the use of the works. So other things that sort of sit around this whole kind of concept are the fact that there are provision for kind of risk reduction meetings. So the parties are obliged to attend regular risk reduction meetings when they're requested by the other party. And that's an opportunity to discuss early warning notices and also something called the risk register. So the parties are obliged to maintain the risk register, keep it updated, and cooperate at risk reduction meetings to kind of seek solutions around those issues and how they could be resolved. The risk register has to get updated to record any decisions that are made in relation to early warning notices and risk items on the register. And also the updated risk register has to be regularly circulated and so on. So you can kind of see how the contract has these sort of laudable aims in terms of dispute avoidance. But just sort of going back to the point I made about sort of the administrative effort that's required with NEC, it definitely does need a good amount of resource committed to it in order to be able to sort of operate it properly. But yeah, really important to understand these mechanisms and make sure you're doing the things you're meant to be doing in relation to things like early warning notices. Okay, the polls are coming thick and fast, so it's time for our next poll. If we could have the question on screen, please. So this is a question about early warning notices, and it is, there are no consequences for the parties in failing to serve an early warning notice. True or false? I reckon you'll be able to have a good guess at this one if you don't know the answer. Okay, we'll just give you a few moments to click on your chosen option. Okay, I think the results are coming through now. Right, overwhelmingly in favour of the second option, false. 91% of you deciding that that would be the appropriate outcome. So you're saying that it's false to say that there would be no consequences for the parties in serving an early warning notice. And 91% of you would be correct. So the contract basically provides that if a party fails to give an early warning notice of an event which subsequently arises, then if the party was aware of that event and the consequences get assessed as if the early warning notice had been given. So basically, if you don't give an early warning notice, later on when the contract deals with the time and cost consequences of that, the assessment there is done on the basis that the early warning notice was given, or in other words, it's assumed that that sort of mitigation has taken place and therefore the cost and program consequences would have been reduced. So another sort of example of how NEC incentivizes proactivity and doing things as you're going along rather than sort of backloading claims and raising things much later on down the line. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, this next section is kind of all about subcontractor or main contractor in the case of a main contract, main responsibilities. So I'll run through these then. First up is the obligation to deliver the work. So the contract provides quite simply that the subcontractor must provide the subcontract works in accordance with the subcontract. Relatively straightforward. What about design? Well, inevitably a lot of the works packages are going to be let on Sizewell C will include an element of design, and naturally some of that will be passed down to the supply chain. So there is, as you would expect, a clause that deals with subcontractors' design. And the contract is set up to allow for design or no design. So it's just a question of how much information about design and whether there is information about design included in the works information section of the contract. So unlike JCT, where it's sort of like with design or without design, and you have to have a separate contract for that, NEC, you can set it up either way. There's a mechanism for dealing with acceptance of the subcontractor's design proposals. So it kind of recognises the fact that the design might not be completed when the subcontract's entered, and there might be sort of design development process that happens throughout the duration of the works. What about using the subcontractor's design? Well, the contract kind of essentially deals with this by the subcontractor granting a license to the contractor to use and copy the subcontractor's design for any purpose connected with, the construction, use, alteration, demolition of the subcontract work. So a kind of relatively standard approach in terms of copyright. But if you're a subcontractor taking on design responsibility, those provisions are going to be really important to consider, particularly if there's anything especially novel or kind of valuable or protected about your designs. And another kind of sort of connected point there is about whether you're subcontracting any design. So if you're taking on design liability, and rather than carrying out that design in-house, you subcontract that out to another party, it's going to be really important to ensure the copyright position in that subcontract is consistent with your own subcontract obligations. So thinking about that sort of pass down of obligations in this area in particular. What about people? Well, the contract contains an obligation to employ key persons. So if there are particular individuals that the client is really keen on having involved in the delivery from the subcontractor's point of view, the contract can set that out. And any replacement of those key persons have to be approved by the other party. I wanted to make a few points about working with the contractor and others. I think one of the key things about a project like Sizewell C is that the overall scheme is going to be made up of many sort of smaller projects and works packages. So kind of interfaces with other works packages and other projects that are going on as part of the wider scheme are going to be really key. So NEC makes provision for the subcontractor to cooperate with others in relation to things like provision of information and also sharing physical working areas on site. And this is really important because thinking about the use of the site, access and so on could have a significant impact on how you plan and coordinate your own works. The next bullet point is about conditions and key dates. So the contract works on the basis that the subcontractor essentially has a start date and a target completion date, but there's also provision for something called sectional completion, which Sophie's going to touch on in relation to optional clauses. But key dates are slightly different. I just wanted to explain how they work. So the programme for the works can set out certain conditions or milestones that the subcontractor is required to achieve by something called a key date. And this can be significant because if the subcontractor fails to achieve a milestone by the key date, then any costs incurred by the contractor as a result of that can be passed on to the contractor. So important to have a look at, probably goes without saying, but important to look at programme, both in terms of start date, finish date and sectional completion, but also, as I say, these key dates, these milestones, and also conditions that have to be achieved along the way. Final thing I wanted to mention about on this slide in the context of main responsibilities is subcontracting. So there are key points, a couple of key points to be aware of here. Firstly, any subcontracting doesn't remove or reduce the sort of primary responsibility for the work that's been subcontracted. So if you pass down responsibility to somebody else to manage your own risk, that doesn't affect your liability upstream. You're still primarily responsible for that work. And secondly, the terms of the subcontract or the sub-subcontract have to be submitted for approval. And quite often on these large publicly procured projects, we often see these provisions being enhanced to basically say that there's an obligation to use subcontracts which mirror and pass down all of the key obligations in the principal contract or subcontract. So it's going to be really important to spend a suitable amount of time and kind of effort getting your supply chain downstream contracts geared up and ready to go. Could we have the next slide, please? Okay, so in this section, I'm going to explain the key points around the subject of time under the contract. So firstly, starting, completion and key dates. So the way the contract works is basically that the subcontractor mustn't start work until the first subcontract access date. So that obviously needs to align very carefully with the programme. There's an obligation to complete the works on or before the completion date, which I've touched on already. And the consequences of failing to achieve this can be serious, and are normally set out in a delay damages clause, which is a secondary option provision, which Sophie is going to touch on later. Linked to all of this is the idea of sort of completion. So it's the contractor who decides the date of completion, and they're obliged to certify completion within 1 week of completion having happened. So as a subcontractor, if you think you've completed your work and you give the notification of that to the contractor, more than a week passes and you haven't had your confirmation of completion, then that's definitely something that you should be following up on and chasing down to make sure you're not unnecessarily exposing yourself to things like delay damages. And then I've already mentioned about conditions and key dates. What else in relation to time? Well, unsurprisingly, programme is a recurring theme here, and it's very much something which features heavily throughout NEC contracts, and that features prominently in this section. So a couple of things to mention here under programme. In terms of the first programme, well, the subcontractor is obliged to submit that for approval within the period stated in the contract. They have to be detailed, and there are very prescriptive requirements in the contract about the information that programme has to contain. The contractor then has 2 weeks to either accept or reject the programme, and they can do that if the programme is either unrealistic or if it doesn't meet the programme requirements stated in the contract. As for revising the programme, so just moving on here to the sort of last bullet point section on this slide, during the works period, the subcontractor has to revise their programme in 3 main situations. So that's when they're requested by the contractor, when the subcontractor decides to update the programme, but also as a kind of fallback position at no longer than the intervals stated in the contract. So there'll be a provision that says, you know, you must update the programme at least monthly or every 6 weeks or whatever it might be, and that's really important. One of the things just to sort of conclude on this slide, one of the things we often get asked about is whether submission of a revised programme can constitute an early warning notice or notification of a compensation event. So the answer there is possibly, but it's definitely safer to give those notifications in a form which kind of expressly say that they are an early warning notice or a compensation event notification, rather than just sending in a programme and sort of leaving it as a little bit of a hostage to fortune potentially later on, in the sense of whether or not you'll be able to rely on that as a notification. Could I have the next slide, please? So there's a handful of points I wanted to make here before we move on from the subject of time. So firstly, I wanted to explain about the concept of takeover. So takeover is different from completion, and just to kind of explain that point. So completion is a defined term in the contract and is really kind of all about what state the works are actually in. So if the works meet the definition of completion, then completion has been achieved and should be certified. Whereas takeover is less about the state the works are in and more about who's actually using the works. So what about when takeover has to happen? Well, in a subcontract scenario, the contractor is obliged to take over the works no later than 2 weeks after completion. So you can have a slight gap between the two. I think in practice, quite often takeover and completion can occur on the same date, but it's just worthwhile understanding that the contract makes provision there to be a gap. between the two. Next bullet point here, what about early use or use prior to completion? Well, the contract basically provides that any part of the works can be taken over before completion has been certified. And this can actually be a pretty helpful mechanism if, for example, the contract doesn't provide for completion in sections, but in practice, as the project develops, it's helpful for parts of the works to be kind of handed over early whilst others are still being finished. So that's something to be aware of and understand as well. Last thing to mention here in relation to time was about acceleration. So kind of as the name suggests, really, this is a mechanism by which the parties can kind of mutually agree to speed up the works or certain aspects of them. So how does this work in practice? Well, in summary, the contractor can request a quotation for an acceleration, and then the subcontractor either submits a quotation stating the changes to the price, the program, the key dates, and the completion date, or the subcontractor can refuse to submit a quotation if they state their reasons for not doing so, essentially. So this kind of recognises that it might be impractical or commercially unattractive for the subcontractor to accelerate their works. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, the last thing I'm going to cover in this part one relates to the subject of testing and defects, and I can foresee these sorts of provisions being really important in relation to Sizewell C works packages, given the nature, sort of sensitive and highly kind of technical and complex nature of the project generally. So on the subject of tests and inspections, well, these will be as set out in the contract or as dictated by statutory requirements or applicable law. Each party essentially has to notify the other before starting a test, and they then have to disclose the results once the test is completed. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the contractor and the supervisor are entitled to observe any testing. So you can't do testing behind closed doors. It's meant to be an open process. And if the test shows up a defect, then the subcontractor is obliged to correct the defect and then repeat the test, and that process continues until the item passes the relevant test, essentially. So moving on then, what about defects? Well, it probably won't surprise you to hear that much like any standard form of construction contract, there are very detailed provisions in the contract dealing with defects. So just to be clear before I go into this, these are the provisions dealing with remedying what we often refer to as kind of patent defects. In other words, these are sort of defects which become apparent from inspections and testing for a fixed period after completion. So this sort of regime is in addition to the subcontractor's liability for what we refer to as latent defects. So those are defects which aren't necessarily apparent at the time of inspection, but they only come to light later on. So if there's a defect which manifests itself much later, so in year 5 or 6 or whatever it might be after completion, that's dealt with under a separate sort of mechanism. So the contractual defect regime is much more about kind of what you might refer to as snagging type issues for a fixed, relatively short period after completion. And I'll just run you through some of the key points here on defects. So first off is the defect state. So this is effectively the end of the period during which the subcontractor is obliged to remedy defects. So this can be anything, something that's agreed between the parties, but 12 months from completion is a kind of industry standard period of time for the parties to accept as being the end of the defects period and the defect state. What else? So the contractor can instruct the subcontractor to search for defects at any time. There's also a reciprocal obligation on the parties to notify each other of defects. And interestingly, regardless of whether a defect is notified, the subcontractor is obliged to remedy it. So again, this is one of those sort of proactive themes. The subcontractor can't just sit back and ignore something if they're aware of it. They're obliged to notify it. They're also obliged to remedy it, even if it hasn't been notified by the other side, by the main contractor. The contract refers to something called a defect correction period. So this is the time which the contractor has to remedy a defect, essentially, or the subcontractor. It's normally expressed as a period of weeks, but you'll often have sort of shorter or longer periods depending upon the seriousness of the issue by reference to different sorts of categories. So defects which can cause a threat to health and safety are normally sort of categorized as urgent, and they come with sort of very short correction periods, but that's just something that's normally negotiated between the parties and set out in the contract. So the contractor is obliged to issue the defects certificate at the end of the period, so i.e. on the defects date or by the defects date. And this can often be important for the subcontractor because, as many of you will know, this often triggers the release of the second half of any retention that's still being held. And finally, on this slide, if there are any defects which are left uncorrected for any reason, the contractor can deduct the cost of having those remedied by a third-party subcontractor. Okay, that brings me to the end of part one, and I will now hand you over to Sophie.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Sophie, and as Stefan explained, I am a senior associate in the construction team, and I'm going to talk to you about how NEC 3 deals with compensation events, issues around title, so that's to materials, plant equipment, and also things you find in the ground, secondary option clauses, Z clauses, and also I will briefly cover inputting the contract data. So if I could have the next slide, please. So compensation events under NEC 3 are similar to relevant events and relevant matters in JCT contracts. They're just rolled in together so that time and money events are not separated out. So if events occur during the subcontract works that cause the completion of those subcontract works to be delayed, those may be a compensation event. Compensation events will usually result in an additional payment being made to a subcontractor and may also result in an adjustment to the completion date or key dates. Contractors are obviously very keen to see that these provisions are back-to-back with the main contract, so that if they are obliged to give time and money to a subcontractor, they themselves can claim it under the main contract. The subcontract, the NEC 3 subcontract limits compensation events to those events and only those events identified in the subcontract. So if an event is not identified in the subcontract as being a compensation event, then no claim should be submitted, even if there is a delay or an increase to the prices. Events that usually constitute compensation events are set out at clause 60.1, and there are 19 standard subclauses or events that are listed. There is also a provision for parties to add additional compensation events, and great care should obviously be taken to ensure that those are defined to reflect the intention of the parties. Very, very broadly, compensation events tend to be those events that impact on the completion date or the prices, but are not a subcontractor's fault. So it might include events that are caused by the contractor or the main contract client, or neutral events such as exceptionally adverse weather. However, it should be noted that in the spirit of this, the overall spirit of NEC contracts, compensation events are not treated as an allocation of blame, just an allocation of risk. And any risk that is not specifically identified as being attributed to the contractor will rest with the subcontractor. So running through that list of 19, I'll run through the most important ones, the ones that we see relied upon most often, really. So those include, obviously, instructions to change the subcontract works information. So that's basically a variation or a change, but unless that results from accepting a defect or a change requested by a subcontractor. Another compensation event is failure to provide access. If you can't get into the site, then obviously there will be a delay. Failure also by the contractor to provide something, so that's usually equipment, plant or materials, by the date shown on the accepted programme. A compensation event would also include an instruction to halt, delay the subcontract works. And if work's undertaken by the contractor, the main client, or others that interfere with the subcontract works in a way that is not set out within the accepted programme, a compensation event may also arise. Physical conditions is also listed as a compensation event, and that's basically ground conditions that could not have been foreseen. Exceptionally adverse weather is also another compensation event, and under NEC contracts that's actually defined, and it's a beyond 1 in 10 year frequency. And then Stefan's already discussed force majeure. So force majeure would give rise to a compensation event. We're all a little more au fait with them than we were probably a few years ago, given COVID-19. But basically, epidemic, pandemic, acts of God, those would all fall into force majeure, and they're defined as events that would have such a small chance of occurring that it would have been unreasonable to have allowed for them. So if a compensation event occurs that the subcontractor considers to be, if an event occurs that the subcontractor considers to be a compensation event, then they must notify the contractor within 7 weeks of becoming aware of the event. Now, this is really important because it's a condition precedent to being able to make a claim, and a compensation event will not be considered if that 7-week deadline is missed. But that phrase, becoming aware of, does leave some scope for dispute. The contractor then has 2 weeks to agree whether they consider that it is actually a compensation event. The subcontractor then has a week to give a quotation. The contractor a further 4 weeks to respond. And when agreement is reached, changes to the subcontract are implemented. Now, the subcontract also makes provision for early warning procedures. And you'll remember that Stefan spoke about this earlier, referring to clause 16. It's worth mentioning again here, as it goes to sort of the core of how events, compensation events, etc., are dealt with under an NEC3 contract. Both parties must give early warning of anything that might delay the works or give rise or give a reason for there to be a rise in the prices. And following that notice, they should have an early warning meeting to discuss how to avoid or mitigate the impact on the project. And if a subcontractor fails to give early warning of a possible delay to the subcontract works or an increase in costs, then they'll only be compensated for the effects that would have remained if they had given early warning. So basically, if everybody had had the chance to mitigate it. If the subcontractor fails to give warning of an event that may give a possible rise to delay in the subcontract works or an increase in costs within 7 weeks of becoming aware of the event, then they won't be entitled to a change in the price, completion date, or key date, unless, of course, that event arises because of the contractor giving an instruction or issuing a certificate, changing an earlier decision, or correcting an assumption. So basically, if the contractor should be aware because they have they've given a notice, then or done something, then of course you don't have to notify them. Next slide, please. Currently, I've got a note here saying I'm not sharing any slides. Well, hopefully the poll. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we should. That's all right, Sophie. So we've now got the third poll question. I was just replying to that statement. Okay. All of what Sophie said was to do with that slide that's on the screen at the moment, the compensation events one. So yeah, it was not moving on to the next slide as we were then going to do the poll. So we're now on to the third poll for you, Sophie.
Excellent, thank you. Thank you. So another little poll. So if you could swiftly answer, the subcontractor must notify the contractor of a compensation event within a specified period from becoming aware of an event. What is the specified period? Is it 7 weeks, 10 weeks, or 12 weeks? Okay, I think hopefully that's enough time. With the answer, oh good, lots of people are listening, it is 7 weeks, which 80% of you got. Under a main contract, it's 8 weeks. So you'll find that the time periods get shorter as they go down the contractual claim chain, obviously to give people the ability to turn it around for the overarching contract. Okay, thank you. So if we could move to the next slide, please. So we'll look at how title is dealt with under an NEC3 contract. And actually, this is the shortest core clause in an NEC3 contract, clause number 7. And it considers title to plant, equipment, materials, and also any existing materials and objects in the site, whether or not known about at the subcontract date or the time the works commence. So the contractor takes title, so that's ownership of any plant and materials which are outside the working areas if they are marked for the subcontract. And the contractor marks them for the subcontract if the subcontract identifies them for payment and the subcontractor has prepared them for marking as the subcontract works information requires. So basically, if they're marked and have been paid for, then title, even if they're off-site, will pass to the contractor. And we found that issues as to title for off-site equipment, materials, etc., has become increasingly in the focus at the moment, and that's obviously because of things like material shortages, more insolvencies, and also just a general rise in off-site construction and modular works. Title, so ownership and whatever plant and materials come onto the working areas, pass to the contractor, but then revert back to the subcontractor if removed from the working areas with the contractor's permission. The subcontractor is made responsible under clause 72.1 for removing equipment from the site that is no longer needed unless the contractor allows it to be left in the works. And then clause 73.1 deals with antiquities. And clause 73.2 deals with materials arising from excavations and demolition and sets out that the subcontractor only has title to such items as stated in the subcontract works information. So next slide, please. So as Stefan explained, the NEC3 contract is set up so that you have the core clauses, the main clauses, which decide pricing and dispute resolution, which will be discussed by Patrick later. And then you can choose some sort of veritable, a little bigger mix of secondary option clauses, and you can elect to use most of them, some of them, or none of them. Some of them cannot be used together, so you can't just do an overall select all. For example, the price adjustment for inflation doesn't apply to option E, cost reimbursable contracts. In reality, the secondary option clauses that are chosen will reflect what was chosen higher up the food chain between the contractor and the main client under the main contract. Secondary option clauses are all prefixed with an X, so you get clauses X1, X2, etc. And there's 20 of them. They should all be considered, obviously, as all the other contract terms are considered, as if they're incorporated into the contract, they have the same weighting, same effect as any other clause in the contract. So I will run through very briefly the most common ones that we encounter. The first one I can see that we've already had a question about is clause X1. So X1 includes a price adjustment for inflation formula, which allows you to change the prices post the subcontract date. And it deals with how the prices and compensation events can be adjusted to take into account inflation. If it's an option A contract, only if that is selected will you get any increase in the prices to take into account inflation. Clause X2 allows for a compensation event due to a change in law after the subcontract date. Again, that was very, very important around Brexit, but also in relation to sort of high-rise buildings, cladding contracts, etc. It's become very important with the Building Safety Act. Clause X4 places an obligation on the subcontractor to provide a parent company guarantee, and clause X13 a performance bond. The forms required will be set out in the subcontract works information. If there's to be sectional completion, then clause X5 should be selected and includes all of the provisions allowing for sectional completion to be worked into the contract. Clause X6 is a bonus for early completion and sets out a daily rate paid as a bonus if you complete early. And then almost conversely, clause X7 is the liquidated damages clause. So it deals with a late delivery. Under an NEC clause, they are called delay damages instead of liquidated damages, and they set out the rate payable by the subcontractor for a delay to the completion date. Clause X15 is to be used if the subcontractor has design liability. Unlike a JCT D&B contract, which includes provisions relating to design dotted all the way throughout the contract, an NEC contract takes the approach of including any design responsibility in the subcontract works information, and then allowing for the inclusion of a duty of care clause, limiting the subcontractor's liability for design to reasonable skill and care. Secondary clause X16 deals with retention. It's worded differently to a JCT contract, but has exactly the same effect, and basically allows for a percentage of each payment to be withheld, usually 3 or 5%, with half being repaid on completion of the subcontract works and half retained until defect certificate is issued. And then the one that most people will be interested in seeing in their contract is a limitation of liability clause, which can be incorporated through clause X18. And that allows a subcontractor to limit its liabilities to the contractor in certain circumstances. X18.4 limits the subcontractor's total liability to the contractor for all matters except the excluded matters listed. And excluded matters includes insured risks and delay damages, which remain uncapped. And it's usually a primary concern to a subcontractor, obviously, that their liability is not unlimited. But obviously the commercial reality is that the contractors generally only accept a limitation of liability if they've got a similar provision under their main contract. Okay, next slide, please. So Z clauses. It's often said that NEC3 clauses, NEC3 contracts shouldn't be amended, but it is recognised that additional terms may be needed to reflect a bespoke nature of a project. And also NEC3 completely understands that parties are free to agree whatever they have done commercially, and that should be reflected in the contract. So these are any amendments to an NEC contract are meant to be captured through the use of Z clauses. So usually you'd have a sort of a schedule at the back, which would amend any clauses in the main, in the core contract, or also add in additional clauses. And that's generally the approach that we see taken. However, some parties do instead take the entire contract, copy it out and put the amendments throughout. So just because you don't see maybe a schedule of Z clauses, or there's only a very short schedule of Z clauses, it doesn't mean that the rest of the contract hasn't been amended. And really you should undertake, the short exercise of just checking have the core clauses been amended in any way. Most commonly we see Z clauses in public body contracts, sort of to deal with public body contracting requirements. So that's around data protection, freedom of information, and then compliance with various policies, such as modern slavery and anti-bribery legislation. And obviously, if you're signing up to those, you need to make sure you've got copies of the policies so that you can ensure compliance. Z clauses might also be used to add in or take away compensation events, and also include additional obligations on a subcontractor, and should therefore be carefully considered. And they should also be drafted with a mind to the general NEC3 language and approach. For example, they shouldn't be adversarial in nature. You know, the language used should follow the the core concepts that Stefan discussed. Next slide, please. So I will briefly cover completing the subcontract data, which is rather like the contract particulars in a JCT contract. It's where all of the project-specific information is captured, such as parties' names, addresses, company house numbers, where the works are to be carried out, and it also will include details of the main contract. It sets out where you'll find all of the supporting technical information. For example, the subcontract works information will be found in. So I'll give you pointers at the other documents to look at. It is split into two parts. The first part is completed by the contractor and the second part by the subcontractor, and both need to be fully reviewed and inputted. So this is again one difference between JCT and NEC contracts is in a JCT contract, there's always a fallback position. For example, the period of deferment, if not entered, shall be 6 weeks. In a JCT contract, there's only blank spaces in an NEC contract. So it's very important that all blank spaces are filled in, or if they're not relevant may be put in. The contractor's subcontract data includes important information such as the subcontract start date, the defects correction period, payment intervals, and insurance requirements. It also sets out which X clauses, so which secondary option clauses have been chosen, and then the details required to complete those. So for example, if you've agreed a limitation on liability, it will be included in the contractor's subcontract data. The subcontractors part includes details as to pricing information, so rates for equipment, hourly rates, and it also states where the activity schedule can be found. It also allows the subcontractor to itemise any risks that need to be managed by way of the risk register. And if the subcontractor is to have design responsibility, it outlines where in the subcontract works information the subcontractor's design may be found. So the subcontract data is one of the most important parts, and it's also one of the most important things to look at when tendering for work. Quite often I get sent a contract to review, but it'll be missing the subcontract data. Now obviously that's one of the most important things because it tells us what additional clauses have been incorporated, levels of liability, levels of insurance, etc. So when looking at a contract for tender review purposes, ensure that the subcontract data is as infilled as possible, and then request further information if you need it for pricing purposes. Okay, and I think I've got another poll. If that can come up. Yeah, you have. Excellent. It's working. So the subcontract data section contains standard default provisions, which means the subcontract has the certainty of reverting to a standard position, even if the entry has not been completed. Is that true or is that false? So are there default positions in the subcontract data for an NEC3 subcontract? Hopefully you've all infilled that now. Have a look at the results. There we are. So 69% say true and 31% false. And luckily the majority of you are correct. There is no default position in the subcontract data for an NEC3 contract. that is a JCT concept. So you have to be very, very careful to ensure that all provisions are completed. For example, if the end of defects is not included, does that mean that it goes on forever? I don't know the answer to that. I hopefully never see it. But under a JCT contract, it would say 6 months. Under an NEC3 contract, it is empty, so it needs to be infilled. Okay, so I am complete, and I will now hand over to Patrick, who will begin with payment and main option clauses. Many thanks.
Thank you, Sophie. If I could move on to the first slide, please, Ashley. Thank you. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is something which is very unique to NEC contracts and very different from JCT, for example. Before you even get into the terms and conditions of an NEC contract, you've got multiple price options or pricing mechanisms to choose from. And I've listed the main ones there. If we take a typical JCT, for example, all the different JCT forms, the design and build, the minor works, the standard building contract, they've all got one pricing option. They're all lump sum contracts. So you put your contract sum goes into the contract, that's how much you're paid, unless that contract sum goes up in accordance with the terms of the contract or down. It's a lump sum contract, sometimes called fixed price, but they're not fixed price contracts because they're never truly fixed. They can always fluctuate. The NEC has an equivalent mechanism with its options A and B contracts. The difference is that option A, your lump sum goes into the contract in the usual way. It's got a different terminology. Being NEC, it's called the total of the prices. And then your scope is broken down into activities in this activity schedule, and you're paid when each activity has been completed. Option B is the same principle, but you're paid on the basis of a bill of quantities instead of activities. So a remeasure type of contract, and a bit better for cash flow because under option A, you're only paid when each activity has been completed. Whereas under option B, you're just paid on the regular basis that you've agreed according to the progress of the works. Now, C and D are what are NEC's very much more innovative pricing options, which don't exist in JCT. They're both target contracts, sometimes called pay and gain share. So these are mechanisms to try and incentivize completion basically on budget. So the idea with target contracts is you agree a target price with the contractor, and then ideally you beat that target price. And in the contract data that Sophie's just mentioned, you would have pre-agreed how you share savings, who gets what proportion of the savings when you beat that target price. So that's the gain, the incentivization. And then the flip side is if you go over the target price and you deliver the works over budget, then again you would have agreed pre-agreed percentages or share ranges for how the pain, the overspend is split between subcontractor and contractor. Option E, you do see sometimes, it's sometimes known as the open checkbook by paying parties. It's basically cost plus. So you get your actual costs plus your agreed markup for overheads and profit. It's used where there's a need to get on site really quickly. The scope may not be that developed, but there's just a need to start work. So that's option E. Okay, if I could move on to the next slide, please, Ashley. Payment in NEC. I've put the clause reference up there, and clause 50 and 51 in the core clauses, but that you won't see everything in there on its own. Sophie mentioned the way that NEC contracts are structured. You get the core clauses, and then effectively these sort of bolt-on clauses at the end, X clauses, Y clauses, Z clauses. The NEC brought in its Construction Act amendments under its Y2 option or YUK2 option. Things like pay less notices and final dates for payment, they're in option YUK2. So you need to look at both together to see the whole payment process. If we just have an overview of the process, it's all built around the concept of an assessment date. So in the subcontract, the contractor is the employer effectively. So they have to assess the amount due at each assessment date. Typically, the last day in each month, for example. You might agree stages, but monthly is common. I've mentioned in the slides the defined cost, which is a very NEC specific concept. I might not have time to go into that today. It could do an entire webinar on its own, but if there's time, I'll come back to it. So the contractor assesses the amount due at each assessment date. And then before the assessment date, you as the subcontractor, you issue your payment application. It's worth bearing in mind that the contractor could put some specific requirements for that application in the scope document. So have a look for anything, any templates or information backup that they're asking for, because it has to comply with that. And your application for payment needs to explain how the sum you've claimed is calculated. Now, that does not need to be the most detailed mathematical calculation, but you at least need some build-up to show how you've arrived at the amount due. So if you just sent an invoice for 100 grand, without any explanation, it wouldn't be enough. You should have some sort of basic calculation to explain the sum you're claiming. And once you've issued your application, the contractor then issues a certificate, assesses the amount due, and issues a payment certificate. Now, before we come on to that, it's worth just focusing on a particular change if you're working on NEC4. In NEC3, there's no real pain, to use a word from the last slide, if you don't issue a payment application. There's still an obligation on the contractor to issue do an assessment as if you had. So there's no real sort of detriment. Big change in NEC4. The subcontractor doesn't issue a payment application. There's a specific provision in there where it says the contractor can assess the amount due as 0. So it's very important to get those applications in each month. So the contractor then issues a payment certificate in response to your application. And then we get these concepts of the due date and the final date for payment, which were brought in by the Construction Act. And this is when you actually get paid and sets your deadline. So the payments become due 14 days after the assessment date. So say last business day of the month plus 14 days, for example. And that's not the actual payment deadline. The Construction Act requires all contracts to have a due date and a final date for payment. It's the final date for payment, which is the actual deadline, and that's 28 days after the assessment date. So broadly, an unamended NEC contract is on 28-day payment terms. Now, one thing to look out for on the contract data is that final payment date can be amended and most likely extended. So that's something to look out for when you receive the subcontract data. But no doubt you'll all operate on payment terms much longer than 28 days. So that's something to look out for. Now, once the contractors issued their payment notice, their certificate, they have to pay you that amount. It's called the notified sum, but by that final date for payment within that 28-day period. They do have an option to issue what used to be called a withholding notice in old language. Now it's a pay less notice. If they want to pay you less than that notified sum, they can do. But they must issue a pay less notice to you at least 7 days before the final payment date. Otherwise, if they don't issue that notice and they don't effectively they don't pay you the amount they've certified, or they don't pay you the lesser amount that they've said they'll pay in the pay less notice, you have a statutory right to suspend works and recover your reasonable costs, provided you've given 7 days notice of your intention to do so. So there's a lot of so it's a strong obligation to pay by the final payment date now. One other point to bear in mind, a practical point, is the deadline for the that 7-day period is a default period for the contractor's pay less notice. That can get shifted, shortened, that time frame. So you could even see in a contract that the deadline is, say, 3 days before the final payment date, or even 1 day, which obviously would not be good for the contractor because they've got more time to put their pay less notice, but not so good for the subcontractor. Not very much, not good for your cash flow. So look out for that time frame being shortened. And then one other point to mention on payment is that if there's a requirement to put in a program, you must put it in, otherwise your payments can be reduced by 25% until it is provided. Okay, if we can move on to the next slide, please. So just moving on to risks and insurance, or liabilities and insurance as they're called under NEC 4. Consistent with the NEC's philosophy on risk allocation and risk sharing, it sets out all of the risks or liabilities which sit with the contractor and which sit with the subcontractor. And those are the events, the liabilities you want to insure against. So I've just summarized what the subcontractors' risks are. So we've got claims from third parties in connection with the works, others, as they're called in NEC language, loss or damage to the subcontract work. So, you know, if a fire rips through the works whilst they're being carried out, for example, damage to property owned by the client or the contractor, and then of course death or personal injury to your own employees. Now, in terms of design liability, it's worth looking at the standard position, which is my last bullet point there, that if there's an error in the design and the design document which contains the error was something which the contractor provided, then that's a contractor liability. You're not automatically liable for the contractor's design. But bear in mind the Z clauses that Sophie mentioned, the amendments. That's quite a common amendment. The contractor might try and push full design liability down to you for your particular package in the contract amendment. So look out for that. And if that's in there, you would be liable for any defects in the design, even if the actual error was in a document that the contractor had provided, because you're effectively verifying the contractor's design in that respect. So full design, like full D&B for your package. So look out for that one. Okay, next slide, please. Let's just have a look at insurance. So naturally, you would want to insure against anything which is your risk under the contract, and you are obliged to under the NEC and insure against these risks. So I've just summarized the various policies which you'll no doubt have anyway, but it's just worth having a look at which one covers each loss. So your public liability policy, that's the one which will cover damage to third-party property and personal injuries to third parties. The contract, the damage to the works will be covered by all risks cover. Your employer liability cover will cover death and PI to your own employees, and you'll have that because it's required by law anyway at a minimum of 5 million. And those first three policies are all required as a matter of course by the NEC terms. Professional indemnity is not required as a standard policy because it won't be required in every contract. PI covers design defects, errors in design. So if you're not doing design, you're just doing physical works, then there won't be a requirement for PI insurance. If you are, the requirement for PI would be listed in the contract data or perhaps in the Z clauses in the contract amendments. And it's worth mentioning that those first two policies, the public and liability and the all risks, they need to be in joint names, those policies. That's a specific term of the NEC clauses. And that's quite important for if it's your policy, it's important for the contractor, and or equally, if you're ever named on a policy as a joint name or as co-insured, it means the same thing. It's very important in terms of its practical effect, because insurers, when they pay out, obviously they don't just leave it at that. They try and recoup their loss from the party who is responsible. They come after whoever, you know, caused the fire or whatever it may be. Obviously, they can't come against you if it's your insurer paying out, because there would be no point having insurance if that's how it works. So they can't go against their own insured parties. So if you become co-insured, a joint name, then that means that you know, neither contractor or subcontractor can be subrogated, to use the term, by the insurer. So it's quite an important provision, and it's required by the NEC. Okay, next slide, please. So I wanted to just go through the termination sort of reasons, really, the contractual basis for terminating an NEC contract. It's quite a detailed regime, and in clause 90.2 there's a table that sets out all of the termination reasons, which the NEC codes as R1 all the way up to R21. And then it also sets out the process on termination, you know, wrapping up how the works are wrapped up, and then the amounts paid on termination. So it's an all-encompassing process. R1 to R10, reason 1 to reason 10, they're all relating to insolvency. So we can skate over those. Either party can terminate for insolvency. There are just 10 different grounds, because there are so many different definitions of insolvency according to, you know, whether you're a partnership or a sole trader or a company, etc., etc. Our reasons 11 to 15, they're all about subcontractor default. So if any of those things happen, 11 to 15, the contractor has to give you a notice and give you the opportunity to remedy. So R11, this is very much a sort of NEC language, substantially failing to comply with your obligations. I mean, breach of contract, really. R12 is not providing a bond or a guarantee, one of the security documents. R13 reflects something that Stefan mentioned earlier on. If you appoint a key subcontractor before the contractor's accepted that key subcontractor, so under NEC, you are required to get the contractor's consent to the name of the subcontractor and the proposed terms. So unless you're using a full NEC pass down, but I would say it's safest to just get the contractor's consent to a key subcontractor on the terms as well. R14, substantially hindering the client, contractor or others, quite similar to R11 really in practice. And R15 is health and safety breaches. If any of those things apply, the contractor must give you a notice, and you've got 3 weeks to remedy them. And if you don't remedy, then the contractor can terminate. R16 is a subcontractor termination. This is picking up on something I mentioned earlier. I mentioned that if you're not paid by the final payment date, then you're entitled to suspend works, subject to giving 7 days notice. But if 13 weeks passes without you being paid, you're entitled to terminate the contract. R17, don't see this one much in practice. This is it's called the doctrine of frustration. It's where you can't complete the contract or perform the contract because of due to changes in the law, or the law prevents you. And then 18, 19, 20, this is all where the works have been suspended. So if the works have been suspended and there's no instruction to resume within 14 weeks, parties can resume according to who was responsible for the underlying suspension. So if it was a subcontractor default that caused the suspension, contractor may terminate. The reverse applies if it was the contractor's fault, you can then terminate, or for any other reason, either party can terminate. Okay, next slide, please. The last three sort of termination reasons, R21, Steph mentioned this earlier, this is the NEC's concept of force majeure. It doesn't use the term force majeure, but that's what it really means. And it's quite a high threshold for it to apply. The contractor can terminate if there's a force majeure event effectively which stops the works from being completed, but there's a lot more to it than that. It's got to stop the works from being completed at all, or delay the works by at least 13 weeks, and be something which no one could prevent, and be something which it would have been unreasonable for the subcontractor to have allowed for. So there's quite a few steps before force majeure can apply. R22, if you commit a corrupt act, the contractor can terminate, so anti-bribery legislation, that sort of thing. R23, if the main contract is terminated, the contractor can terminate the subcontract. And then lastly, you'll see that there's no termination for convenience, just for any other reason, just without default. That does sometimes get introduced as a bespoke amendment, and in NEC 4, there's actually an X clause, X11, which brings that in as well. So that may well be added onto the contract, but it's not in the sort of core clauses, but one to look out for. Okay, on to the last slide, please, on dispute resolution. So dispute resolution in NEC is not hugely different to any other contract, because things like adjudication are a matter of right under statute. There's a few nuances to bear in mind which are quite important. Again, the dispute resolution clauses are brought in by these bolt-on sort of clauses at the end of the contract. We're mostly dealing with option W2, which is where the Construction Act applies. I'm just seeing that my first bullet points are the wrong way around. It's W2 if the Construction Act does apply, which will be most physical works projects in the UK. All the Construction Act provisions around adjudication, etc., will apply. So just briefly, what is the process? There's a fairly formal process for referring disputes to senior representatives. If that's something you can choose in the subcontract data. It's a bit more to it than just saying we'll meet. You have written submissions which can't be disclosed, so you don't sort of prejudice yourself by making any admissions. There's a 3-week process to try and resolve the issues, as many meetings as possible. It's a bit more structured than just saying our directors will meet your directors. And then the key one at clause 2.2 is adjudication. If you've got a dispute from a subcontractor perspective, probably that you haven't been paid, you can adjudicate at any time, regardless of whether you've been to senior representatives or not. And for those of you who've been through that process, you'll know it's a very fast, quick, much cheaper process for resolving disputes than going to court. You basically send a notice to the contractor telling them what the dispute is and what you want to have decided by the adjudicator. You've then got 7 days after sending the notice to send them your main claim document, which is called the referral. You've also got to get an adjudicator appointed in that 7-day time frame, which is pretty straightforward. And then once you have sent your claim document within that 7 days, the adjudicator's got 28 days to consider everything and issue a binding decision. So I'm sure all of you will have had some experience of adjudication over the years. And then lastly, there's an option to take the same dispute to the tribunal, which you can choose as either court or arbitration. I would choose court. Arbitration's become so bloated over the last 20 years. There's not much difference to going to court. It's not much cheaper, and it's certainly not much quicker. So you can take the same thing to court if you don't like your adjudicator's decision, but it's important to bear in mind it must have gone to adjudication first, and you must tell the contractor that you're taking it to court within 4 weeks of the adjudicator's decision. So quite a hard cutoff there. If you don't tell them within 4 weeks, you sort of lose your right to go to court, and the adjudicator's decision becomes final and binding. Okay, that's a quick sort of a rapid overview of dispute resolution in NEC. I think we might have one more poll before I finish. So back onto payment timescales. If the contractor wants to pay less than the sum they have certified, what's their deadline for issuing their pay less notice? How many days before the final payment date? Is it 1 day, 5 day, or 7 days? Let the results come in. 94% of you say 7 days, and 94% of you were correct. Well done. That's the time. That's the time frame, 7 days. But I should have perhaps put the lawyer's answer as option 4, which is it depends, because 7 days is the default, but that can be amended. So very much one to watch out for if the contractor tries to reduce that to 1 day. Beware. Okay, that's it on dispute resolution.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Patrick. And thank you also to Sophie and Stefan. Huge amounts of information. I've got lots of writing, and I'll almost certainly be watching it back as well. And I'm not one of the ones who's going to be signing a contract. So look, we've got a few questions that have come in. So some are in the chat, some are in the Q&A, some have come direct. So I'll ask them in an order. And obviously then if you guys can jump in and answer as and when, that would be fantastic. First one, which I guess I'll probably touch on, which is in the Q&A, which we mentioned hydrogen at the start, but no mention of EVs and charging infrastructure. Do these play a part in the delivery of Sizewell C? The short answer is yes, Linda, they will. Where I was talking about hydrogen earlier, it's more about the infrastructure that's needed for hydrogen, because Sizewell has that ability, as well as produce electricity, to actually produce what would be classed as pink hydrogen. That's why a lot of the focus is on hydrogen. If you take EV, obviously there will be a need of EV. You know, bear in mind this project takes 10 to 12 years to build. So whatever percentage of us in 10 to 12 years is going to have an EV just to travel to and from the park and rides, or potentially to and from Sizewell C if you're working there. So EV infrastructure is going to be a key part of it. But there's an element of chicken and egg to this. We certainly, in parts of Suffolk, we need to produce more electricity and get the electricity in the right place to be able to put the EV charging infrastructure in situ. But we have discussed little aspects of EV with the alliances and with the lead contractors on Sizewell, and it is a factor that will be looked at through the construction and the design phase. So if you're a business that specialises in that, stay engaged on the portal, and I'm sure at some point we will be engaged and talking to you. Other question on there, if there is NEC4 now, why are Sizewell using NEC3? I can answer it, although I see Steve's been able to join us again, so I'm not sure. Steve, do you want to touch that quickly?
Hi, yeah, thanks, Ash. It's predominantly the principle of building Sizewell is that we're going to replicate HPC, and everything we do to replicate obviously costs us less and gets it done quicker. We've been using NEC3 for a long time at HPC, and we've honed it into what it is now. So we've got feedback from the contractors, we've got feedback from the client, and we believe it's the right model. If we were to go down the route of starting again with NEC4, it'd obviously cost us a lot of money. And the contractors that we're using, the tier ones that will transition from Hinkley Point C to Sizewell C, will obviously be used to the contracts as they're written. So it's about replication, it's about cost saving for us, and making it simpler to those that we've been working with for a long time.
Just I can supplement that if it's helpful, Ashley and Steve. I mean, NEC4 was kind of a bit of a sort of, it was an evolution, I suppose, rather than a revolution from NEC3. So it's different. I'm sure the people at NEC would say it's better, but it's not sort of dramatically different. So I can completely understand, you know, the logic that Steve has just described in terms of sticking with the tried and tested models from Hinkley Point.
Perfect. Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Steve. Quick one that got put on there. Would it be possible to obtain a copy of the presentation? Yeah, yes, we will. So as well as, you know, sharing various bits of contact information, so that you can get in touch with ourselves and team at Birketts and so on. Should you wish to, we'll also be sharing the presentation anyway, as well as in the links to where it's been recorded. So that's fine. A couple of other questions that have come in on the chat. I'll do the most recent ones because I haven't written them down yet. So as Birketts are supporting help in the process and the chamber, does that preclude them from getting involved in specific contract and subcontract advice? I mean, the short answer is no, but Stefan, from a legal perspective, yeah.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. No, it's an interesting point, John, thanks for raising it. So when we talk about us helping the chamber, to clarify, what we mean is really that the chamber is sort of putting us forward to, you know, their members as being able to support them in advising the individual businesses in relation to their contracts. So Suffolk Chamber isn't sort of our client necessarily in this scenario. We're not sort of advising them on these contracts. It's just that it's a sort of, I suppose you could call it a sort of partnership or whatever, that sort of scenario whereby we're working together to be in position to be introduced to the members if they require assistance. So yeah, we can advise the businesses that are part of the Suffolk Chamber's membership, absolutely.
And I think the important point to clarify on that, so, you know, key to our role is to deliver that support that's needed. That's fundamentally what we're there to do. That doesn't necessarily mean we actually physically can deliver it because we're not the experts. In this example, we've brought Birketts in. In other examples coming up, we'll be bringing groups like Wild East in, Inspire Suffolk, maybe some other consultancies. So it's about us finding some experts that we can happily utilise. It's only fair to say, it doesn't have to be Birketts. And, you know, I've chatted to this at Stefan. This is not to say that Birketts are the only people that can give advice on NEC3. There's a lot of companies, and just as a reminder to all of you who are signed up on the portal, you can search for these companies yourself by utilising the portal to find that, and we can always create those relationships and make those intros for you as well. The key is there's a historic relationship where Birketts already working on the project. We have a close relationship with them. It makes sense to utilise them in this example. But certainly it's just about being able to get the right information across to the supply chain so that if you need that support, and hopefully many of you will by winning contracts, you'll know where the place to go is and potentially have a little library and a document of information that you can go back to. Couple of other points. So does a supplier need to have specific accreditations, things like such as Achilles, etc., to be part of the supply chain? I think on that question, it's an unknown entirely at this stage still. We're looking still on that whole relationship, a bit like NEC and NEC3 and NEC4. We're looking at the relationship between Hinckley and Sizewell. Those two projects are being brought closer together, all about that lesson learning, that saving of time, cost, wastage. So imminently is what we're hopeful is we as a team will be able to get that information out to the supply chain so that if there is certain standards you need, certain standards that would be advisable to have or nice to have, then we will ensure you're aware of that well in advance of any of this work actually taking place. So keep staying engaged with us on that one, and we'll let you know. One of the other ones, where does the contract stand regarding price increases after programme completion date if there's no fault? If a fixed price period isn't clear in the contract, would price increases still be valid if after a completion date has happened? So I'm looking more at the Patrick, Stefan, Sophie side of this.
Well, it comes under payment, so I'm happy to pick it up. So in terms of contract, so price increases after the completion date. Yes is the short answer. Sophie talked about compensation events. You'd need to notify a compensation event to get a change in an increase in the price, and the contract says that compensation events can be notified up to when the defect certificate is issued, and the defect certificate is issued at the end of the defect liability period, or the defect date in NEC speak. So the short answer is yes.
Just because I'm no expert on this, anything more to add, or is that everything?
Well, I can supplement that a bit. I mean, there's a secondary option clause in the contract, which is, I think it's X1, excuse me, which if you apply that option, then it gives greater flexibility for the party who's carrying out the works to claim an increase in their prices. It's interesting the way the question's couched about whether increases can come in after the completion date. And I completely agree with Patrick's what he said, but I suppose from a timing point of view, it's quite interesting. I mean, if you've, because at that stage, in that example, you've finished your works and presumably you've been paid on an interim basis as you've been going along. So if you're trying to claim a price increase after you've finished, I suppose you might get into the realms of, you know, if that was something which arose, if the reasons for that price increase arose earlier in the process, did you raise an early warning notice and was it sort of dealt with in an appropriate way, rather than it sort of being kind of backloaded till later on? But in principle, yes, there are methods in which price increases can be claimed, subject to, you know, the relevant sort of options that have been set out in the particular contract.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Another one, does the obligation to act in a spirit of mutual trust and cooperation actually have any teeth?
Yeah, thanks, Ashley. I can take that one as that kind of cropped up in my section. Yeah, it's a really interesting point, actually, and it's one which kind of the legal world has grappled with a bit ever since NEC first came out, because it was so different to how contracting was done previously. It was much more adversarial. The sort of legal world has kind of struggled to really get its head around what an obligation of mutual trust and cooperation really means. And it's sort of relatively untested, I suppose, in the sense that there haven't actually been a huge number of cases on that particular point. There was one relatively recently in 2017, Costain and Tarmac, to do with a subcontract for the safety barrier on the M1 motorway, and there was a sort of circa £6 million claim by Costain against Tarmac, and it went to the High Court. And part of Costain's case was that Tarmac were in breach of the obligation of mutual trust and cooperation, spirit of mutual trust and cooperation. But the courts didn't like Costain's argument. They basically said that whilst those clauses do have their place in a legal sense, you know, what Tarmac were doing in that situation didn't kind of amount to what the court referred to as sharp practice. So I think it's, you know, it's probably quite a high sort of threshold in terms of being able to be found to be in breach of that obligation. But nonetheless, it's not a completely sort of toothless provision. It's just that we haven't probably seen enough cases on that particular point to have a really kind of detailed understanding of what it fully means in a legal sense.
I think practically, whilst operating an NEC contract, if you don't act, if either party doesn't act as stated, you will both lose. You won't meet your schedule, you won't meet your costs, you'll fall out, and that's not in anybody's interest. But you know, recent contract management has shown that the better relationships you have, the more certainty you have around delivery and cost. And that to me is more about what NEC is for. And it's about forcing you to have that relationship of mutual trust. Because if you don't have it, everybody fails. That's my take on it.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that. It goes back to that point you mentioned earlier, Steve, about NEC is not a contract that you sign and then just put in the drawer and pull it out at the end if there's a dispute. It's more of a project management tool, and that spirit of trust and competence sort of goes right to the heart of the collaborative ethos, which you need both parties to buy into for the NEC to work.
Cool. All right, thank you. All right, last couple of questions. I appreciate I've just seen we've hit 12 o'clock. So a couple of simple ones for me. The MEH stage, I think the question was asked, you know, when it comes to the MEH stage, is it all going to be procured by the MEH Alliance, or will there be opportunities for locals? That'd be both. Exactly the same as the Civils programme. You know, the Civils Works Alliance is being set up at Sizewell to run and operate the project. but they will subcontract their work because they have to. The size of the project, the social value and ESG requirements of the project means that they will self-deliver and they will also contract. The MEH Alliance will be exactly the same. It's not the same type of MEH Alliance that you see at Hinckley. So because that terminology used, I'm going to assume that's someone that sees what's happening at Hinckley. It's not that same model. But no, you will have an alliance of 5 or so companies that will form the mechanical, electrical and HVAC alliance at Sizewell in exactly the same way you have the equivalent in the civils. And our role will be to help introduce you into those companies in the tier 1s when that time is correct to start engaging with them. And we are already starting that in some pockets. And also someone raised the point about hydrogen. The easy way, my point on hydrogen, just email me, ashley@suffolkchamber.co.uk, drop me a message, email any of the team, and I'll be sending you an email with a little bit of feedback form on that very soon. Final question that come through, will NEC contracts be for soft services as well as hard services? Simple answer to that is yes, but Stefan, I think you said you'd like to answer that one.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ashley. I guess you've answered the will they be used, and then there's I suppose the legal point is can they be used, and the answer is yes, they can. So which form of contract or subset of the contract gets used depends a little bit what you mean by soft services. If you mean sort of facilities management type services, then there's a couple of options. There's the term services version of NEC, which is a contract that gets put in place for a fixed period of time, and the contractor or subcontractor delivers sort of maintenance type services over that period of that arrangement. Other options are, if you're talking about, when you say soft services, more of a sort of supply only type arrangement. So if you're providing goods, for example, to the project, then there is an option with NEC 3 for that as well. There's an NEC 3 supply only contract option as well. So depending exactly what the particular type of soft services are, the answer is yes, there will be an NEC sort of subset or form that can kind of fit with that type of provision.
Better answer than mine, Stefan. So thank you. Look, that's pretty much all the questions, and I appreciate time as well. So if anything else does creep through, then we'll add them to what we send out to everyone and what we put on our website, so that every question is answered. And if anything hasn't been clear, hopefully that will help. Obviously, as always, go back to what I said earlier. Myself, the team, we're here to help. So if you have any questions at all based on today, anything to do with the project, anything to do with the previous webinars or any of the events we've got coming up, please just get in touch. That's what we're there to do. But if there's nothing else, we will bid you all good day. Hope the sun stays shining, and hopefully see you very soon to help you sign some of these NEC 3 contracts. But thank you very much, everyone, and have a good day.